Welcome to the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 615. I'm Tom Cagley, your host. Today, the Software Process and Measurement Cast features my discussion with Jeff Dalton. Jeff and I discussed the new cybersecurity model, the CMMC, and the need for a hyper-focus on cybersecurity. The use of this new model cannot be just another plaque on the wall. Jeff Dalton is Chief Evangelist at AgileCxO.org, a research and development organization that studies Agile leadership. He is a technology executive with over 30 years of experience as a CTO, CIO, VP of product development, and for the past 15 years has been the CEO of Broadsword and AgileCxO. He is an executive Agile coach, Agile assessor, an instructor, a regular conference speaker, and author of both the Agile Performance Holarchy, an operating system for Agile Leaders, and the Guide to Scrum and CMMI, improving Agile performance with CMMI. In his spare time, Jeff is an instrument-rated pilot and plays bass in a jazz band. He has degrees in music and computer science. He is one of my favorite guests, and I've had him on the show more than once. Are you ready to talk cybersecurity and the new CMMC? It's time for the interview. Jeff Dalton, welcome back for the probably 752nd time. No, I'm kidding about that part. But welcome back to the Software Process and Measurement Cast.
I am so happy to be back and so thrilled that you asked. So nice to see you, Tom.
It is always my pleasure. It's always a fun conversation, always a conversation that I learn from. And if you can get fun and education, sort of infotainment kind of stuff, I'm all in. Jeff, today, the CMMI Institute has been up to something new in terms of cybersecurity. There are a couple of things, there are a couple of terms that get thrown around that I'd like to sort of take apart and get some definitions, because I don't think a lot of my listeners have heard of this stuff. So things like acronyms and things like that probably will go over their head at least a little bit. So there's something called the CMMI Cyber Maturity Platform. There's the Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. Let's take those two things apart. Are they different? Are they related?
Sure. Well, absolutely. Those things are different, but have some relationship. So the cybersecurity platform that you referred to is a product that the CMMI Institute developed really under Kirk Batula's leadership a couple of years back. And they went through a really interesting product development process to make that a reality. And it's really kind of a self-assessment tool and method for assessing your cybersecurity platform. Completely new product idea, completely new process, and some really cool stuff. But it's distinct and different from the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, which is CMMC. So I know a lot of your audience members are CMMI professionals, and they know a lot about that business, among other things. And if you think of CMMC as a very similar product development deployment model that we saw in CMMI in 2000 and 2001. So that, if you think about what happened, the DoD said we got to do something to address the quality of engineering and software development and other product development type processes. And so they, put their heads together, connected with the FFRDC and put together the CMMI. And that, of course, begat appraisers and trainers and, the whole ecosystem around how that becomes institutionalized, because it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Like we've talked about this before, like in order to make something happen, you actually have to do something. And they thought it through pretty well. The independent assessors outside of our appraisers, I keep using the term assessors because that's what CMMC uses, independent appraisers and partners, and they sort of kept the decision-making about the appraisals out of the Institute so that they didn't have an appearance of impartiality. And they really did a lot of things right when you think about it. We can talk about whether they made mistakes or not, I guess, but for the most part, they did it right. And if you think about that, and then you say, okay, now they have something called the cybersecurity maturity model. And if you pick apart this model, also developed by the SEI, Software Engineering Institute, the folks over at CERT, 5 maturity levels, a bunch of practices, independent body to sort of administer the program, independent assessors and partners. They're calling C3PAOs. Architecturally, it's like a twin of the CMMI. So, if you take that all into consideration and kind of step back and say, okay, what do we have here? We have a set of industry-leading best practices that are derived from other standards, just like CMMI, right? Because CMMI derived its standards from lots of other places, and derived from NIST 800-171 and from ISO 27001 and a little bit from CMMI, frankly. And they put together this model and they said, let's do it. And so now what's happening in the market is we're in the stage of the accreditation body ramping up with starting to train assessors and getting that infrastructure all up and running again. So in a lot of ways, it's like conceptually like CMMI Redux, although it's a very different model and a very different audience.
Why use the same sort of, at least visual infrastructure of the CMMI for the CMMC?
Well, I think, I think the concept of maturity model makes sense. I'm a fan of the approach. I think that if it's applied correctly, it really can be very powerful. And I think that, the issues with the CMMI that we often talk about have nothing to do with the architecture of the model, which is, pretty well proven and pretty effective. And so it seems to me that they took something that they knew worked and they knew was effective, and they said we need to replicate some of those lessons and do something very similar. Now, it's interesting because if you look at the CMMC model architecturally, it looks as if version 1.3 of CMMI and version 2.0 had a baby. For instance, it looks very much like 1.3, but there's no generic practices. There are embedded, for those of you that aren't familiar with CMMI, the generic practices were what I used to call the secret sauce, the things that made process real, like getting people trained and making sure it's measured and all that kind of good stuff. And in version 2.0 of CMMI, of course, they took all that out and replaced it with a specified set of practices that address those issues. And so the CMMC does it that way, which is a good thing, but otherwise it very much looks like 1.3 of the model. So it seems like it's a proven approach, and it seems like a necessary approach. I know there's a lot of consternation and concern in the market about how this is going to play and how this is going to affect people's ability to bid on work. And it's the same discussion we had with CMMI years ago. But up until now, companies were self-attesting to be compliant with NIST 800-171. And I think they're starting to find out that there's a big difference between self-analysis and having an outside assessor come in and do that analysis. So it's going to be a really interesting couple of years.
So is this just for providers, or is this for people who actually do work and are not just outside of the DoD provider sort of environment?
Well, right now the target is very much like how CMMI rolled out. It's a DoD initiative at this point in time, so it's being targeted towards the defense industrial base. Basically what amounts to 300,000 plus companies in the defense industrial base. So if you think about, you take one of the bigs like a Lockheed Martin or a Rockwell or a Raytheon, they have very intense cybersecurity programs, and they should, because they're dealing with data and designs and textual data and all kinds of information that needs to be protected. Katie Arrington tells a story of how $600 billion a year were stolen from the defense industrial base last year in terms of intellectual property, and that we spent billions of dollars building the F-35, and months after we deployed it, the Chinese showed up with a version of it that down to the screws was exactly the same plane. Well, that's the way she tells that story. I'm not an expert at the F-35, but I believe that to be a true story. So they had to do something, right? And so the DoD is saying, okay, it's Raytheon, but it's also the people that make the engines. It's also the people that make the screws. It's also the people that make the wheels. It's the people who work on the tarmac and the test. It's the entire supply chain. So if you were to build a traceability matrix from Lockheed down to the people that mow the lawn at Lockheed, you're talking, because all of them are entry points, right? So if you look at it that way, there's 325,000 organizations that need to be assessed. And even within those 325,000, there's very likely to be multiples, which makes the number much larger. So this is a really massive problem to solve, but it's a good problem to solve because it's something that we are suffering from, and we have evidence that our enemies are infiltrating our systems, and we have to do something about it.
If that, obviously this is a problem with many places. I mean, Target. We remember Target's hack a while ago, and that came through an HVAC vendor. So I understand how things fan out. How does this model stop that?
Well, so like any other model, I mean, if you take, you and I have talked about Agile a lot, and, the reasons Agile frameworks like Scrum and XP and SAFe have been deployed is to help alleviate problems, but not stop problems, right? So there's nothing about deploying Scrum that promises that your team's going to be successful at self-organizing and delivering customer value, right? But the idea here is if we modify the behavior in such a way that it encourages that we will have better results, right? CMMI is the same way. There's, is it possible to be a level 5 company and still blow big projects? Well, healthcare.gov proved that, right? Because the prime on that company, on that project, blew up spectacularly on October 1st, 2010, a day I'll never forget, was a level 5 company. So there really is an assumption that if you adopt a maturity model or a process that you won't have breaches and intrusions. But there's an assumption that you'll have a lot less of them, and that if you have them, you'll find out about them faster, and that you'll constantly have this notion of cybersecurity infrastructure in the front of mind. And that's really what maturity models are about. So I would never say that adopting a process guarantees something wouldn't happen, but it certainly makes it less likely.
If you do it for that reason. I think both of us have been at this long enough that have seen any number of people, and whether it's the CMM going back in time, the CMMI, or any other framework that just do it for the check the box kind of scenario. Is the way the CMMC, that acronym is never going to work for me, but is the CMMC, is that structured such that it's much harder to go down the path of just checking the box and actually not delivering any improvement in cybersecurity?
Yeah, that's a valid question and a valid concern that has come up over and over again. I spent a lot of time on social media, and I was on LinkedIn the other day, and I saw a company advertising all the templates you need to pass a CMMC appraisal or assessment, we're calling it. And it was just a face palm, right? I could see you palm in your face. And that's exactly what I did when I saw it. And I was just like, I went back to the board and I'm like, I don't know if you're a science fiction fan, but one of my favorite science fiction television shows is Battlestar Galactica, the reimagined version. Fabulous television. And there's a mantra in there, which is, this has all happened before and this will all happen again. And I say that over and over again in these board meetings because everything we saw happen is unfolding. And so we're trying to take early action. And I think one of the things that, I think I don't know if you read my book, the CMMI Scrum book, but in the intro to that book, I talk about early adopters, and I talk about how early adopters set the standard, right? So like with CMMI, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and Rockwell Collins and SAIC and Accenture, well, maybe not Accenture because they weren't around then, I guess, but these big companies who adopted CMMI early on, they set the standard for how it got adopted, right? And so then the industry is looking at these and saying, oh, here's how you get CMMI level 3. You do it like Lockheed does it. And Lockheed, of course, prior to it, and I'm not picking on Lockheed, I'm just using them as an example. These big companies, prior to adopting CMMI, always had lots of documents and lots of bureaucracy and lots of oversight and lots of measurement and big waterfall command and control systems in place. So when they went to receive their CMMI rating, that's how they did it, right? Because that's how they did everything. So then you had all these small little agile companies coming along and saying, I got to get CMMI to bid on this work. So how do I do it? Oh, I produce a bunch of these documents, and don't you have any templates you can give me? And it just becomes this big go rodeo, right? So the CMMC, the early adopters are being very carefully piloted. So we've already conducted a couple of pilots, and we're doing our best to avoid that in a couple of ways. One is we're changing the reliance on documents that you see with CMMI. Even today, the reliance on artifacts, we're not focusing on that as much as observation, test, examination type techniques, actually seeing stuff. So we've talked about, you and I have talked about the Agile Performance Holarchy before and how it's really more of an observation-based method for Agile teams. It has some of that in it. And I was lucky enough to have some input into that. Seeing stuff is better than reading about stuff. And while documentary evidence is always going to be part of any assessment, the observational evidence tells us a much better story about actual adoption and behavior versus documentation. And one of the challenges so far in the pilots has been the same challenge we've seen sometimes in CMMI, and that's, well, I have the documentation, that must mean I'm level 3. Or, come by and look at our documentation and tell us if we're level 3. Can I just send it to you and you give it, send me a certificate back, So we're trying to avoid that by taking more of an observational approach and just being much more careful and circumspect with the pilots to make sure that the early adopters aren't really driving the behavior for everybody.
How is actual efficacy? Is efficacy part of the assessment? Is that or is there, even if it's not, is there some mechanism to tie efficacy back to the model in an improvement feedback kind of scenario?
Yeah, there are practices in the model to evaluate, let's just call it behavioral consistency. And this is something that I am passionate about, is we need a way to not just say yes or no. In other words, it's not binary. It's, has this been happening over time, and has it been improving and getting better? And, that from that standpoint, yeah, we're looking at the efficacy of the established process and whether it's actually happening over time and improving as opposed to just being executed for the one time. So there is a requirement, just like, well, frankly, CMMI has it too, and we don't see enough of it. I mean, if you asked me, does CMMI have a mechanism to evaluate consistent behavior and improvement, I would say yes, it absolutely does. If you were to ask me, do all companies actually demonstrate that during appraisals, I would say I'm not. I mean, they do for my appraisals, but I'm not convinced they always do in the way they should. At least we hear stories. So we're hoping that we're really, I guess hope isn't a methodology. We call that being on hopium. It seems to be the most pervasive framework, especially for estimating these days. But we're leaning very heavily on that process and behavioral part. And the pilots that I've observed, the assessors who are the really fine folks from DCMA, DIBCAC, who do assessments for a living, they've really dug in on this really nicely. So I'm hoping that sets the standard.
Understand. We do all of this. How does it change the marketplace? And does it change the marketplace immediately? When do people have to be certified? When does that actually happen? Is there a line in the sand?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So a couple of things. So the great thing, the thing I think is really, I mean, I'm a kind of contrary person in general. I guess you probably already know that, but the great thing to me about this isn't the assessments, it's the hyper awareness that this is generating. Like everybody is jacked up about this that you talk to in the defense industrial base, you know, all the big companies, everybody's calling and writing and saying, what do I do? What do I do? And they're all worried about it. And I mean, you've been through CMMI appraisals. I always tell my appraisal team during the preliminary findings, which is the night before the final. I know you've been on appraisal teams. I always tell them, we're not going to tell them if they pass tonight. We're going to tell them what their weaknesses are, and we're going to make them sleep on it. Because, and I'm not even sure the Institute really even got this when they created the preliminary findings, but it's a change management tool, right? It's like, okay, they just read to me all the things we're bad at, but they didn't tell me if I passed or not. So now I'm going to worry all night about whether I'm actually doing it right or not. And I think that's great, actually. I mean, I guess it could be considered a little mean, but I'm just like, I want you to think about this stuff. I want you to really think in your mind, could I have done a better job on this? And it's amazing how powerful it is, because the next day people come in and they're like, yeah, Jeff, you know what? You're right, man. We are really dropping the ball on this. And then, you're like, okay, well, you still passed. So, it wasn't that bad. But you really want people to think about stuff, right? And so I think one of the great things about CMMC is that it's getting so much press, and way more than CMMI ever got, and so much attention that everybody is hyper aware. So with that as a backdrop, everybody's wanting to get assessed now. Like I've had hundreds of people call and say they want to go through the process. There is a rulemaking effort that has to take place, a FAR change that has to take place that happened with CMMI as well. You remember back in the early 2000s, we had the so-called mandate. Everybody talked about the mandate. Well, the mandate was a rule that allowed procurement officers to put CMMI in the RFIs and RFPs. Then the mandate went away. Well, that meant the rule changed, that they didn't have to do it anymore. And now the CMMI is an optional requirement for RFPs for the government. So all that stuff, I didn't know this before I got into this, but all of this kind of happens behind the scenes in the executive branch where they make rules, right? And it's a whole process that I'm not privy to at all, but there is a rulemaking effort underway, and they've publicly said that it will be the end of the year before that rule is finalized. Now, at that point, they're talking about putting a certain amount of contracts in play and that number is being talked about, but a certain amount of contracts or RFIs in play that say if you want to bid on this work, you have to be CMMC level 1, 2, or 3. And at that point, there'll be assessments happening in earnest. So I don't know what the exact number is, but let's say it's 10 contracts. Well, 10 contracts could have 500 partners, right? When you think about a prime and all their partners and all their subs and going all the way down to the lowest level of the supply chain, that might generate 500 to 1,000 assessments that have to occur pretty quickly. In the meantime, between now and then, which could be up until early next year, they'll be doing pilot assessments. There'll be some what we're calling provisional assessments, which are kind of like mock or pilot, and there'll be some DoD assessments. But I don't think we'll see like huge volumes of assessments. And when I say huge, I mean thousands, because the volume here is unprecedented. I mean, what did we do in CMMI last year? 3,400 or something like that. And it was the best year ever, right? When in 2010, it was 1,000, right? And so when the Institute spun out to the CMMI Institute, they went from 1,300 to 3,000 in a few years. So really a huge, more than double. We're talking 300,000 here. And there's talk with some people that have said publicly from the DoD that they're going to do 7,500 next year. And I don't know if that's possible, but the volume here is unprecedented. So it's going to be a super interesting journey, and we're trying to build a scalable infrastructure that'll support it.
What's the capacity like?
Well, we've spent the last, started in January, so the last 8 months building out a infrastructure to support it, with a plan to train as many as 2,000 assessors quickly. And we've taken we haven't released all of this yet, and some of it's public and some of it isn't, but we are doing our first training. Well, we've done pilot training already, but we're doing our first public training in August. And then we'll be distributing the training around to various training providers around the country, probably hundreds of training providers, or dozens anyway. The technology is being spun up now. We're in deep conversations with various vendors to make that happen. And we've created a role and process infrastructure. That's kind of what I'm focused on is, what are the prerequisites to get in? What's the career path? We've really had to create a whole ecosystem here. So a lot of the stuff, one of the mistakes I think that the CMMI Institute, or SEI, I guess, made, whoever put that program together anyway, was that they didn't really define a career path so much. They said, you can be an appraiser or you can be a teacher, right? And both of those paths were kind of separated. You could be a teacher without being an appraiser. You could be an appraiser without being a teacher, and they were all kind of independent. And we tried to create a career path so that someone just getting into this industry, if they had appropriate prereqs, could go through a program and get themselves to the point where they're a full-blown assessor and an instructor. So we spent a lot of time working on that infrastructure, and that's all defined and all rolled out. We've got about 500 applicants in the first week, just rolled out recently, and we're weeding through those right now. And we're going to be releasing the names of the first 70 assessors. Hopefully by next week. We're going through a selection process now, which is mostly random. We expect to announce that next week and get them moving on some pilot assessments.
Wow. Interesting.
Speed of light. Yeah.
Well, again, usually when capacity can't match demand, something gives, and it's usually nothing good comes of that.
Yeah.
In the long run, does this new approach to cybersecurity, the framework, the assessments, the certification, all of this stuff, does it generate resilience within the organizations that use it?
Yeah. That's a great question. And of course, we all hope it does. And we expect that it will. We do have the challenge that you alluded to earlier of those companies that maybe see this as another plaque on the wall. We call that plaque buildup, that don't take it as seriously as they should. And I think that we're going to be backstopping to that as best we can through a very rigorous multiple layer QA process. So the QA and QC of this is going to be far more rigorous than what we've seen with other models. But I really didn't appreciate, and I'm really glad I volunteered for this board, because I really didn't appreciate the depth of the problem, the depth and breadth of the problem. We hear about breaches, Equifax and Target and, Visa, and these things are bad, but and I don't mean to be dramatic here, because I'm really not, a militant person, but the enemy is inside the wire. And I had no idea, and the public has no idea just how bad it is. We hear stories about, the Russians are doing bots on Facebook in the election and all this stuff. My gosh, if that's the only problem we'd have, we'd be lucky. Our adversaries are in our bank accounts. They're in our government systems. They're in our regulatory systems, they're in our energy systems in ways that most people don't seem to appreciate. And I'm just blown away by what I've learned and the threat that is out there that is only getting worse. I don't know the exact numbers, but there's foreign adversaries that have whole military divisions sitting at computers working on hacking into systems in the US. And you just don't imagine that. So when people say, this, I'm not going to name countries, but, this country's really becoming a great country. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. They're actively fighting a war with us. We just don't know it. We just don't see it while we get to go out to the park and the beach and enjoy the great life that we have. We don't see that we're actually under attack. We just don't know it. And it's a serious situation. So for me, and I don't mean to be dramatic, but it's just true. I don't know if any process or maturity model fixes that. I was asking my wife the other day, who was very keyed up about all this stuff, because I unfortunately keep talking about it and I probably got her all nervous, but she's like, we need to disconnect from the internet. And, you think about it, the only way to ensure that a foreign adversary isn't hacking into your system is to literally turn off the internet. That's the only way. We can harden systems and we can reduce intrusion and we can work really hard to make all this stuff happen, but it's a computer. Somebody's going to find their way in, right? And I don't know if you've got a firewall on your computer, but I look at it every day and there's hundreds of attempted intrusions every single day. And I have no idea where they're coming from. Thank God I've got the firewall. But so the thing about the maturity model, I don't mean to rant on this, but the thing about the CMMC is the hyper awareness that it's bringing to the table. Like, everybody needs to be thinking about this in the country, everybody. And we need to stop. I don't mean to be a drag, but we need to stop arguing about where we should wear masks and start worrying about how do we keep adversaries out of our systems and bank accounts and schools and social media and all that kind of stuff, because it's a much bigger problem. And let's get serious. And this hyper attention given on it caused by this, the DoD is going to roll this out, and other agencies, of course, are going to roll that or something like it out. And then the Walmarts and Targets and GMs and Fords and Chryslers of the world are going to roll it out, just like with CMMI, right? And it's going to happen. But at least that's what I believe. And it's not a plan. It's just what I believe. Everybody needs to be hyper-focused on it. And if this is a way to do that, then I'm totally on board with it.
Jeff Dalton, this was everything I hoped it would be. It was wonderful. And yeah, I've got some notes and some things to think about. Hopefully the listeners do too. Jeff, if people wanted to continue this conversation, how would they go about doing that? Obviously not hacking into your system to do it, though.
Yeah, because I've got multiple firewalls going on. So when I've disconnected my house from the internet, no, I am those of you that have listened to Tom's show know that I'm a social media addict, and LinkedIn and Twitter, CMMI appraiser on LinkedIn, on Twitter, and just my name on LinkedIn are great places to have a conversation. I'm always open for a good, respectful debate on social media. And of course, love to see you over at broadswordsolutions.com, where we continue our CMMI Agile business and really try to keep that flowing as well. So really appreciate you having me on, Tom.
In Reread Saturday news, this week we took a break. I ran a half marathon instead of writing, but we'll be back next week. I've actually got most of the work on Chapter 14 in the can already. You can catch up with all of the previous installments of Reread Saturday from the links in the show notes. The Software Process and Measurement Cast is a proud sponsor of the following events: the Rust Conference. Let's talk about Rust, September 15th at the Live at Manning Conference. Link in the show notes. Women in Tech Conference. It's all about achieving diversity, inclusion, and equality in technology. October 13th, link in the show notes. And finally, the Agile Online Summit, which is coming up October 26th through 30th. And talking the Agile Online Summit next week, the Software Process and Measurement Cast number 616 will feature our discussion with Tom Henriksen on the state of Agile and preparations for the Agile Online Summit. If process improvement is a never-ending journey, why do so many people ask, are we there yet?